Tired of sugar-coated news and corporate spin? Check out The Nicole Sandler Show. Speaking truth to power with the irreverence it deserves. Smart, fearless, and just the right amount of snark. Nicole breaks down the headlines, exposes the hypocrisy, and talks with the people working for real change. Weekdays at 3 Eastern, noon Pacific on Progressive Voices. NicoleSandler.com, Substack, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't just get the news, get the truth.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hi, Truth Seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of the UnSpun Journal Club. It's a weird time where I live in the United States politically. Usually the summer's pretty quiet. Lots of people take vacations, and our government's not super active, at least the Congress part. But right now, we are in the middle of a run-up to some pretty important midterm elections. Right now, one political party, the Republicans, holds the presidency and both parts of our legislative body, the Congress. But that could change this fall. And if it does, it means it may be even more difficult for President Donald Trump to get his ideas supported. So a lot of people are making a lot of noise about politics, and a really important question is anybody listening? I did an episode last week on bias in the media. In particular, I looked at the conditions that might cause the media to be biased and how politicians understand and talk about bias in the media. You can go back and listen to the full episode. It's the one right before this one in your podcast app. But as a basic summary, historically, media has tended to be partisan. There were some fairly consistent causes of that, including when technology gives people more of a choice of media to follow, when the electorate itself gets more politically polarized. In fact, some people would argue that the turn to nonpartisan media is actually the anomaly, and that the media has generally always been at least somewhat linked with power. So in this week's episode of the Journal Club, we're going to be looking at a new article that came out in May of 2026 that looks at a different aspect of media bias. It looks at ordinary people and how they formed their opinions on the media bias. It had some things I didn't expect, and I think you'll find them pretty interesting. Sound good? Let's get unspun. If you want to measure if the media is biased, you can do it in a few different ways. Frequently, you will look at news coverage and you'll consider one of two things. The first would be how much one group versus an opposing group actually gets covered. Are there more news stories about one would be the question that you would ask. A more subtle version of this might be where stories about a group are placed. Are they, page one news when they show up? Are they in the A block, the first block on our news show? Do you make social media posts about them? Do you pay to promote only certain social media posts? Do they show up at the top of the app? All of those things. Another way to do it is to look at how they're actually covered. So these can be the words that are included in a script or printed on a screen. It can include the incorporation of images or the length of pieces, or even if things like background music is used or if an interview has been edited. All of these things have been used to point to accusations of media bias. Generally speaking, in a Western democracy, they might have that neutral value in their news. We've seen in the last 10 to 15 years a trend toward more biased coverage. That doesn't mean that every outlet is biased all the time, or that every story will contain bias, but you can identify some pretty clear trends. And of course, politicians love to yell about this. They love to tell their audiences that they're being treated unfairly. Sometimes this is just a way to make people who support them feel sorry for them and give them even more support. For governments with authoritarian tendencies, this kind of accusation of bias is usually used to justify suppressing the media in a lot of different ways, trying to get journalists fired, for example, getting licenses pulled from networks, that kind of thing. And interestingly, it's also used to justify what people call independent media. So these are people who do journalistic type work but are not affiliated with media outlets. And the logic here is that the organization of media into a business is something that makes them biased or makes them more susceptible to bias. I did a previous episode about this, which I will link for you in the show notes because I think it's a pretty important social trend. But today's article from Dr. Gina Masulo and her colleagues at the University of Texas does things differently by looking at how the consumers of news might form an opinion about if the media is biased or not. Now, they point out at the start of the article that people's trust of news in general has been going down for quite a while. And this matters because people who do not trust the media tend to follow the news less, so they are less well informed. And someone's ability to participate in public life is directly impacted by how informed they are. So making that choice to sit out can be pretty unfortunate. They also point out that a way that news consumers define bias may be different from how researchers measure it. In their article, they're looking at perceptions of liberal media bias from conservatives. That doesn't mean that liberal audiences don't think that media is biased towards conservatives. They do. That was just not the focus of this study. In particular, in case you're interested, liberals tend to think that the media existing as large businesses is a source of pro-capitalism, pro-business, and pro-government bias. Okay, back to the article. They start out with a pretty interesting history of that perception of liberal media bias going all the way back to the 1950s. They note that conservative media like magazines and like the National Review are not just an alternative for conservatives, but they're actually sort of pitching themselves to the public as a corrective against a pernicious liberal bias. As we've talked about before on UnSpun, they talk about how politicians have taken advantage of this kind of a claim. Politicians going all the way up to the president and the vice president have made claims, for example, that TV networks are controlled by elites, and as such, they don't talk about you, the everyday person. So this paper focuses on the everyday person. And they're talking about what they call the folk theory of journalism, which is how a part of the audience for news understands the news to work. And the best way that you find out how people understand something is to ask them. They approached this by asking 3 research questions. The first was how the conservatives that they talked to viewed the mainstream news. The second was how they might define bias in news. And the third might be what techniques they would use to tell if the news was biased. Their method was pretty great. They did a very large survey of almost 3,500 people, and then they also did interviews with almost 100 of the people who filled out the surveys. To do the interviews and to be able to cover a lot of the country, they partnered with journalists from 27 different local newsrooms, radio stations, TV stations, and newspapers who actually conducted the interviews. The newsrooms that the interviews were conducted from also helped recruit people to participate in the survey by posting links. They made sure that they asked people to participate who saw themselves as conservative or right-leaning, but then they went through a process to ensure that the respondents were in fact right-leaning, and that's how they came up with that close to 3,500 people, which is a great number. One of the things we talk about in research is when we're sampling, that's people trying to get groups that represent the bigger group that they're choosing. They published a table in the paper that suggests they were pretty successful in getting a wide diversity of Americans. It did not perfectly match the demographics of the country, but it was substantially more diverse than many studies like this would typically be. And so that gives us some confidence in the things that they find. One of the first questions they asked was about how people in their sample got their news. And this was interesting to me because most people nationally will say they get the news from social media now, but that was the 5th choice for respondents in the survey, with newspapers, radio, and cable TV all placing higher. They also responded about who they trusted the least in terms of news outlets, and the top mentioned by a lot was CNN. However, they also said they distrusted ABC News, MSNBC, some said all media, and some said Fox News. And so that suggests that they just generally distrust the news. When they were asked in the interviews about news, they found 2 folk theories. The first one they called "I don't have a Confederate flag." Researchers called that news that stereotypes conservatives as right-wing extremists, and there were kind of 2 subparts to that. The first was the idea that journalists try to do their reporting to fit a left-leaning narrative. The second was that they use left-leaning language. The theory was that, matching up pretty well with other research on news bias, that news organizations select stories to favor a particular idea or attitude. They called this the only looking at one side of things theory. And this one has been supported in literature that looks at the content of actual news. And the writers say, quote, "This finding suggests that the problem of fixing the perception of news bias, at least among conservatives in the study, is more challenging than providing accurate news information, it requires reconnecting with this part of the American electorate in substantial ways, listening to their stories, and including their voices to regain trust. And that's the end of the quote. Because of the type of interview study that this was, they do include some quotes in the transcripts of their interviews that I thought were pretty interesting. So, for example, one older man from Pennsylvania said he thinks journalists believe conservatives are just, quote, negative, angry people. Or in other words, researchers said he was representative of an idea of a good versus bad, where people with conservative views believe the media just portrays them as bad. Another stereotype was assuming that people with conservative values were racist, or white supremacist, or classist. Respondents noted that in the news media, when they do report conservative voices, they don't tend to report or include minorities who have conservative views. Now, when it comes to the perceived tendency of journalists trying to fit conservative actions into an existing narrative, there's a quote from a respondent talking about the coverage of January 6th, who said, quote, "The overwhelming majority of people were peaceful. They were there to peacefully protest, but yet the press made them out to just be evil." The researchers noted that hundreds of people were convicted of crimes, but they also stated that the interview showed that at least some conservatives will see news as biased unless the news reflects their viewpoint. And this is something, again, that has showed up in other studies. When it came to the terms that journalists used, there were some really interesting examples of terms that conservatives felt were biased. Some of them included assault rifle, voter suppression, and anti-abortion. The researchers noted that the AP Style Book, which is a guide for a substantial number of U.S. journalists, actually encourages terms like abortion rights as an attempt to be neutral. And so it's really interesting to see that for the people that they interviewed, this attempt at neutrality came off as bias. Their second big finding moves a little bit more into representation. The idea that news stories represent liberal viewpoints more often or more fairly than they do conservative ones. So, for example, when a respondent felt like he didn't see coverage of Republicans as much as he did coverage of the Democrats, another felt that news stations should be covering people with anti-vaccine views as much as they covered the usefulness of vaccines. And in the discussion, the authors say that this is a troubling challenge, quote, for journalists because factual evidence supports the fact that there was an insurrection and that vaccines work. They talk a little bit about the idea of false equivalency, where a journalist could try to make both sides seem equal, but if they do that, it might give people a distorted view because one side is in fact true and the other is in fact false. And so I think for us truth seekers, that gives us something to think about. It's worth paying attention to that representation, to that diversity in sources. There can be all kinds of reasons why one source might get covered more than another, not the least of which is willingness to talk to the media. But it could be helpful to remember that even when you talk to your friends or coworkers or neighbors about what's going on in the news. It can be good to sit and talk seriously with people, even if you know you're not going to agree with them. Just the fact of being heard seems to be important. The researchers conclude that it's essential to have diverse conservative voices, not just the loudest ones, in stories. They also suggest that maybe journalists need to explain terms they use and why they are using those terms in that way. Okay, truth seekers, thanks for coming for this week and for our episode of the UnSpun Journal Club. Stay sharp, everyone. Thanks for getting UnSpun with me this week. UnSpun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.
Care Talk with Laura Packard is a podcast covering healthcare in America from a progressive perspective. Our healthcare system is broken, and we all know insurance companies are out of control. If you don't have health insurance or don't understand the differences between insurance plans, or have surprise medical bills, out of control prescription drug costs, or can't get the care you need, listen to Care Talk with Laura Packard weekly on Tuesdays. What's going to happen to your healthcare under the Trump administration? From prescription drug prices to health insurance costs, from healthcare for seniors and people with disabilities to reproductive care, from care for veterans to public health, including vaccinations. Healthcare experts answer your questions every week, and they go in-depth on Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, private insurance, and more. Go to healthcarevoices.org/caretalk or search for Care Talk with Laura Packard on your favorite podcast app to listen today.